A grieving widow, left with nothing but her small bakery and a mountain of debt. A glamorous mistress, laughing in her face at the reading of a billionaire's will. One woman has lost everything, the other is about to gain it all. But the dead man left one final, secret instruction, a DNA test to confirm the identity of his true heir. Everyone thought they knew the answer. The mistress was certain, the wife was hopeless. But in a sterile lab, a tiny cotton swab held a secret that would shatter a dynasty, expose a devastating lie, and prove that the quietest person in the room often has the most powerful truth to tell. The rain that fell on the day of Walter Montgomery's funeral was a cold, relentless drizzle, the kind that seeps into your bones and chills you from the inside out. For Lori Bennett, it felt like the sky was weeping with her. Standing under a simple black umbrella, her worn coat pulled tight around her small frame, she was a ghost at her own husband's farewell. Walter Montgomery. The name itself was a skyscraper, a monument of steel and glass that dominated the city's skyline. Founder of Montgomery Holdings, a real estate empire worth billions, he was a man of immense power and even greater secrets. To the world, he was a titan of industry. To Lori, for 10 years, he had simply been Walter. The man who loved the smell of her yeast-leavened bread more than the scent of money, who would sneak into her small bakery. The rolling pin, after hours, his expensive suit dusted with flour, and share a warm croissant with her in the quiet glow of the ovens. They had a simple life, a life Walter insisted on keeping separate from his corporate kingdom. He'd bought her the bakery, her lifelong dream, and their cozy two-bedroom house in a quiet, tree-lined suburb felt like a world away from his penthouse apartment downtown. He called it his sanctuary, his escape. Lori, hopelessly in love, had believed him. She never asked for more, content with the gentle, quiet man she knew, not the cutthroat mogul on the cover of business magazines. Now he was gone. A sudden, massive heart attack in his office on the 80th floor. He was 58. Lori was 35. Her grief was a hollow ache, a cavern carved out of her chest. But as she stood by the graveside, another pain, sharp and humiliating, pierced through the fog. It came in the form of a woman who was everything Lori was not. Giselle Dubois was a vision sculpted from marble and ice. Her mourning attire was a custom-tailored black dress that likely cost more than Lori's monthly mortgage. A wide-brimmed hat with a delicate veil failed to conceal the triumphant glint in her sharp, sapphire eyes. Beside her, clutching her hand, was a boy of about 7, with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a miniature suit. This was Leo. Walter's son, she claimed. Giselle had materialized out of the shadows of Walter's other life, the life Lori was never permitted to enter. She had marched into the funeral home as if she owned it, her head held high, a silent declaration that she, not Lori, was the true keeper of Walter's legacy. The mourners, a sea of dark suits and stony faces from the corporate world, parted for Giselle like the Red Sea. They offered her their condolences, their whispers following her like a rustle of dry leaves. Lori, the legal wife, was ignored, an inconvenient footnote in the grand story of Walter Montgomery. The only person who acknowledged her was Beatrice Montgomery, Walter's older sister. A formidable woman with a spine of granite and a permanently disappointed expression, Beatrice gave Lori a curt, dismissive nod. "Lori," she said, the name sounding like an unpleasant taste in her mouth. "A tragic day." There was no comfort in her words, only a cold finality. Beatrice had never approved of the marriage, viewing Lori as a common baker who had somehow ensnared her brilliant brother. As the final handful of dirt was thrown onto the casket, Giselle caught Lori's eye across the grave. A slow, cruel smile spread across her perfectly painted lips. It was a smile of victory, a promise of what was to come. Lori felt a tremor of fear. Her quiet life with Walter had been a fragile bubble, and she was just now realizing how sharp the world was outside of it. The drive to the law offices of Adler, Finch and Strauss for the reading of the will was a blur. Lori's best friend, Sophie Chen, a fiercely loyal lawyer who worked in a different field, held her hand the entire way. "You're his wife, Lori," Sophie insisted, her voice a comforting anchor in the storm. "You are legally entitled to a spousal share. No matter what that woman thinks, the law protects you. But Lori wasn't so sure. Walter had always been cagey about his finances, waving away her questions with a gentle, "Don't you worry your pretty head about it. I've taken care of everything." She had trusted him. Now she prayed that trust hadn't been a fool's errand. The boardroom was as opulent and intimidating as Walter himself. A long mahogany table gleamed under a crystal chandelier. Beatrice was already seated at its head, her posture ramrod straight. Giselle and Leo were on one side, looking like a royal family in mourning. Lori and Sophie took seats opposite them, feeling like paupers invited to a king's feast. Mr. Jonathan Adler, Walter's longtime attorney, a man with kind eyes but a somber demeanor, entered the room carrying a thick leather-bound document. "Thank you all for coming on such a difficult day," he began, his voice resonating in the quiet room. "We are here to read the last will and testament of Walter Harold Montgomery." He cleared his throat and began to read. There were bequests to charities, a trust for his sister Beatrice, and generous bonuses for his executive staff. Lori's heart pounded against her ribs, each beat a drum of anxious hope. Then Mr. Adler paused, looking over his spectacles at Lori. "To my wife, Lori Bennett, a woman whose kindness was a balm to my soul, I leave the property at 45 Orchard Lane, fully paid and clear of all liens. I also bequeath to her a one-time tax-free sum of $250,000 to ensure she and her business are secure." Lori's breath caught in her throat. The house was theirs and the money was enough to pay off the bakery's debts and live modestly. It was a relief, but it also felt final, a parting gift. Not the provision of a partner, but the severance package of an employee. Across the table, a soft musical sound floated through the air. It was the sound of Giselle Dubois laughing. Giselle's laugh wasn't loud or boisterous. It was a low, sophisticated chuckle, a ripple of amusement that was somehow more cutting than a full-throated roar. It was the sound of utter, unassailable confidence. Every eye in the room turned to her. She dabbed at the corner of her eye with a lace handkerchief, not to wipe away a tear of grief, but one of merriment. $250,000, she purred, her voice dripping with condescension. She looked directly at Lori, her sapphire eyes gleaming with malice. "Why, Walter must have truly cherished you. That's almost enough to cover my jewelry budget for one season." Beatrice Montgomery shot her a look of pure acid. "Giselle, this is hardly the time for—" "Oh, hush, Beatrice." Giselle waved a dismissive hand, adorned with a diamond ring so large it seemed to catch and fracture the light. "We all know what this is. A little parting gift for the baker, a thank you for all the warm bread and domestic comforts." Lori felt her face burn with a heat that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. It was the scorching fire of humiliation. Sophie squeezed her hand under the table, a silent message of support, but Lori felt utterly alone, pinned by Giselle's cruel gaze. Mr. Adler cleared his throat again, a stern look on his face. "If I may continue—" "Please do, Jonathan," Giselle said, leaning forward and placing her elbows on the polished table. She looked like a panther, sleek and ready to pounce. "Get to the important part, the legacy." Mr. Adler adjusted his tie and continued reading, his voice now devoid of any warmth. "All remaining assets, including but not limited to my controlling shares in Montgomery Holdings, all domestic and international properties, my investment portfolios, art collections, and liquid assets are to be placed in a single, irrevocable trust." He paused, the silence in the room stretching into a tense, vibrating wire. This was it. The billions. The empire. "This trust," Mr. Adler read, his voice heavy with significance, "is to be administered for the sole benefit of my son and my only heir, Leo Dubois." The words landed like a physical blow. Lori felt the air rush out of her lungs. She looked at the small blond boy sitting beside his mother. He was fidgeting with a toy car, oblivious to the immense weight that had just been placed on his young shoulders. Giselle's smile was blinding. She reached over and smoothed Leo's hair, her touch proprietary, her expression one of pure, unadulterated triumph. She had won. She had won it all. "Of course," she said softly, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "My Leo, Walter's only son, his pride and joy." She turned her gaze back to Lori. The pity in her eyes was more insulting than the laughter had been. "You see, dear," she said, her voice a syrupy whisper, "some women provide comfort. Other women provide heirs." Walter understood the difference. He knew who was truly important. He knew who would carry on his name. The implication hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Lori had been the helpmeet, the diversion. Giselle had been the mother of his legacy. Lori's 10 years of marriage, of love, of shared quiet moments, had just been rendered meaningless, erased by this woman and her son. Beatrice looked thunderous, her lips pressed into a thin white line. She may have disliked Lori, but her brother posthumously declaring this woman's child as his sole heir was a deep, familial insult. "I think," Lori said, her voice a choked whisper, "I think I need some air." She stood up, her legs trembling. She felt dizzy, the opulent room tilting around her. Sophie was at her side instantly, her arm a steadying presence. As they walked toward the door, Giselle's voice followed them, a final parting shot. "Don't spend all that money in one place, dear. Perhaps you can get a new oven for your little bread shop." The laughter of her victory echoed in Lori's ears as the heavy oak door closed behind them. In the hallway, the dam of her composure finally broke. Sobs racked her body, deep, gut-wrenching sounds of grief and betrayal. It wasn't about the money. It was the complete and utter invalidation of her life with Walter. He had built a wall between his two worlds, and in the end, he had made it brutally clear which world truly mattered. Sophie held her, letting her cry. "She's a monster, Lori. A soulless, gold-digging monster." "He lied to me, Soph," Lori wept, her face buried in her friend's shoulder. "For 10 years he lied. Our life, it was a lie." She thought of her own son, Finn, her sweet 8-year-old Finn, who was at home with a babysitter, happily building a castle out of Legos, unaware that his world had just been turned upside down. Finn, whom Walter had always treated with a kind, if slightly distant, affection. He'd called him Lori's boy. He'd never once hinted at a desire to adopt him, to make him his own. Now Lori understood why. He already had a son, a real son. As Sophie led her towards the elevator, the boardroom door opened again. Mr. Adler stepped out, his expression grave. "Lori, Mrs. Bennett," he corrected himself quickly. "Might I have a word? There is one more clause, a stipulation. It's of the utmost importance." Lori looked at him through tear-filled eyes, too numb to process what he was saying. What more could there be? The humiliation was complete. The fortune was gone. She was nothing but the baker, the poor wife, cast aside for the mother of the real heir. Lori wanted to refuse, to just get in the elevator and flee the building that felt like a monument to her husband's deceit. But something in Mr. Adler's eyes, a flicker of urgency, perhaps even pity, made her pause. Sophie, ever the lawyer, gave a sharp nod. "We'll listen, Mr. Adler." He led them back into the boardroom. The atmosphere had shifted. Giselle was no longer smiling. She stood by the window, her arms crossed, tapping an impatient rhythm on her arm with a perfectly manicured nail. Beatrice remained at the table, her face an unreadable mask of cold fury. "What is it, Jonathan?" Giselle demanded, turning around. "Is there some sort of delay in the transfer of the assets?" "My son is the heir. It's quite clear." "The will is clear, yes," Mr. Adler agreed, settling behind the table once more and putting on his reading glasses. He looked down at the final page of the will. However, Walter was a meticulous man. He left nothing to chance. He included a final provision, a codicil to be executed before the trust can be formally established, and you, Giselle, can be confirmed as its primary administrator on Leo's behalf. Giselle's eyes narrowed. A provision? What kind of provision? Mr. Adler looked up, his gaze sweeping over everyone in the room, before finally landing on Giselle. He wrote, "As my legacy is the most important thing I will leave behind, its foundation must be beyond reproach. Therefore, I demand that the paternity of the child named as my heir, Leo Dubois, be confirmed unequivocally." A confused silence fell over the room. Giselle let out a short, sharp laugh. "Paternity? Walter knew Leo was his son. He adored him. This is absurd, a ridiculous formality. It is not presented as a formality, Mr. Adler said, his tone firm. It is presented as a legal requirement. The will explicitly states, and I quote, "The inheritance is contingent upon a positive paternity test conducted by a court-approved independent laboratory using the authenticated DNA sample I have on file with this firm." He opened a drawer in the mahogany table and pulled out a small sealed box marked with a biohazard symbol and a string of official-looking numbers. Walter provided this sample 5 years ago, specifically for this purpose. It has been held in secure, medically approved storage ever since. The codicil is legally binding. No test, no trust, no confirmation, no inheritance. Giselle's face for the first time lost its perfect composure. A flash of something, annoyance, anger, and perhaps something else, something deeper, crossed her features before she smoothed it over. "Fine," she snapped. "This is a waste of time and an insult to my son's identity, but fine. If Walter wanted one last piece of bureaucratic nonsense to prove a point, so be it. Schedule the test. Let's get this over with so I can take control of my son's future." Lori stood by the door, a silent observer to this new drama. It meant nothing to her. It was just a delay in Giselle's ultimate victory. A final strange request from a man she was realizing she never truly knew at all. All she wanted was to go home to her son, to the simple, honest life she had built, even if its foundation had been a lie. "The test will be scheduled for next week at the Sanford Genetics Center," Mr. Adler stated, making a note on a legal pad. "My office will coordinate with you, Giselle, and with you, Beatrice, as the executor of the estate." Beatrice gave a stiff nod, her eyes fixed on Giselle with an unnerving intensity. It was clear the formidable sister-in-law smelled something she didn't like. As they all prepared to leave, a thought, small and unbidden, crept into Lori's mind. It was a whisper from the deepest part of her grief. He was so meticulous. He left nothing to chance. Why would a man so certain of his son's paternity demand such a cold, clinical confirmation from beyond the grave? It felt odd, contradictory to the narrative Giselle had painted of a doting father. Later that evening, curled up on her sofa with a cup of tea, the house felt cavernously empty. The smell of cinnamon and baked bread, usually a comfort, now felt like a reminder of the simple baker Giselle had mocked. Finn was asleep upstairs, his breathing soft and even. Lori stared at a photo on the mantelpiece, a rare picture of the three of them at a local fair last summer. Walter was holding Finn on his shoulders. He was smiling, but his eyes, she now saw, seemed to be looking somewhere else. Sophie sat across from her, a legal pad in her lap. "Something about this stinks, Lori. A mandatory DNA test? It's not standard practice unless there's a pre-existing doubt. A massive pre-existing doubt." "But doubt about what?" Lori asked, her voice hoarse from crying. "He had a son with her. He left him everything." "Did he?" Sophie countered, leaning forward. "Or did he leave everything to his son with a clause to ensure he wasn't being played for a fool? Think about it. Walter was a brilliant, ruthless businessman. Do you really think he'd risk his entire multi-billion-dollar empire on blind faith?" The question hung in the air. Lori thought about Walter's precision, the way he could dissect a complex business deal in minutes, spotting flaws no one else could see. He trusted no one in business. Why would he be any different in his personal life? Then a memory surfaced, hazy at first, then a sharpening into focus. It was from about 3 years ago. Walter had come home late, looking pale and shaken. He'd been quiet for days. When she'd asked what was wrong, he'd waved it off as a stressful negotiation. But one evening, after 2 glasses of whiskey, he looked at her with a strange, haunted expression. "People will do anything for money, Lori," he'd murmured, using his pet name for her. "Anything. They will lie, cheat. They will build entire lives on a foundation of lies. You have to be so careful who you trust." At the time, she thought he was talking about a business rival. But now? Now the words felt chillingly personal. A crazy, impossible idea began to form in her mind. It was so audacious, so utterly unthinkable, that she almost laughed at its absurdity. But it took root, a tiny seed of doubt planted in the barren ground of her despair. She looked at Sophie, her eyes wide. "Soph, I need to ask you something. As a lawyer. Anything." "That DNA test," Lori began, her heart starting to beat a little faster. "It's to confirm if Leo is Walter's son, right?" "Correct. Is there any way, is it at all possible, for someone else to be tested against Walter's DNA? For comparison?" Sophie's eyes lit up with understanding. She saw exactly where Lori's mind was going. It would be highly irregular. We'd need a legal basis, a reason to contest the will's primary assumption. Lori stood up and walked to a bookshelf, pulling out a dusty photo album. She flipped through the pages until she found what she was looking for. It was a picture of Finn as a baby, just a few months old. He was a tiny, perfect thing, wrapped in a blue blanket. And in the corner of the photo, almost out of frame, was a small engraved silver rattle. "Walter gave him this," Lori whispered, her finger tracing the outline of the toy. "He said it was a family heirloom. He said it had been his when he was a baby." She had thought it was just a sweet, sentimental gesture at the time, a kind gift for Lori's boy. But what if it was more? What if it was a clue, a silent acknowledgement of a truth too dangerous to speak aloud? "Sophie," Lori said, her voice trembling with a mixture of terror and a strange burgeoning hope. "I want my son tested." The week leading up to the DNA test was a crucible of tension. For Giselle, it was a period of mounting frustration. She made several irate calls to Mr. Adler's office, demanding to know why the process was taking so long and decrying the entire exercise as a posthumous insult from a man who had become, in her words, paranoid in his later years. To the outside world, her confidence was a fortress. She was seen lunching at expensive restaurants, fielding calls from financial advisors, and discussing renovation plans for the Montgomery penthouse she was already occupying as if it were her own. She was performing the role of the soon-to-be-confirmed Queen Regent, impatient for her coronation. But behind closed doors, cracks were beginning to show. One evening, her housekeeper, a discreet woman named Maria, overheard a hushed, frantic phone call. Giselle was speaking in rapid-fire French, her voice sharp and panicked. Maria only caught a few words. "Impossible. A secret. And a name. Pierre." When Giselle emerged from her study later, her face was pale beneath her makeup, and her hands trembled slightly as she poured herself a glass of wine. The fortress had a flaw in its foundation. Meanwhile, Lori's world was a whirlwind of a different kind. Sophie had filed a preliminary motion with the probate court. It was a long shot, a petition to include another child in the court-ordered paternity test based on what she carefully termed newly considered evidence of the deceased's potential paternal acknowledgement. The evidence was flimsy at best. The story of the silver rattle, a few sworn affidavits from friends who'd heard Walter refer to Finn with unusual affection, and the vague, cryptic statement he'd made to Lori about lies. Most legal experts would have laughed it out of court, but Sophie was brilliant, and she argued her point not on the strength of the evidence itself, but on the principle of due diligence. "The will's own codicil opens the door," she argued to the judge in a preliminary hearing. "Mr. Montgomery himself demanded absolute certainty regarding his lineage. In the interest of fulfilling that final wish for absolute truth, we must explore all plausible avenues. What harm is there in one more test to ensure the man's final, explicit demand for certainty is met?" The judge, a stern but fair woman named Judge Peterson, was intrigued by the will's unusual clause. After reviewing the motion, she made a surprising ruling. While she wouldn't officially contest the will on Lori's behalf yet, she granted the request for Finn's inclusion in the testing. It was an addendum, not a challenge. Leo Dubois remained the presumed heir, but now a second set of data would be collected. When Giselle was informed, her rage was volcanic. She called Lori directly, her voice a venomous hiss over the phone. "What do you think you're doing?" she shrieked. "Dragging your bastard son into this? Are you that desperate for a piece of the pie? Walter felt sorry for you, that's all. He tolerated your little boy because he was sleeping with his mother. Don't you dare try to spin that pity into a payday." Lori stood in her kitchen, the phone pressed to her ear, and for the first time she didn't flinch. The raw humiliation from the will reading had been cauterized, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "My son's name is Finn," Lori said, her voice steady and clear. And if Walter was so paranoid about his legacy, then he should have no objection to one more swab of a cheek to make sure the truth comes out, whatever that truth may be. She hung up before Giselle could respond, her hands shaking not from fear, but from adrenaline. She had no idea what the test would reveal. The logical part of her brain told her it was a fool's hope, a fantasy spun from grief. Finn had her eyes, her smile. She saw nothing of Walter in him, but love and biology were two different things. Her love for Walter had blinded her to so much. What if her grief was now blinding her to a truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along? The night before the test, she sat on Finn's bed, watching him sleep. He was 8 years old, a bright, happy boy who loved science and soccer in equal measure. He knew his dad, Walter, had passed away, and he was sad, but his life was so blessedly simple. Laurie's heart ached at the thought of the complex, sordid adult world she was about to drag him into. She found the silver rattle in his memory box. It was heavy, tarnished with age. Engraved on the handle were the initials WHM, Walter Harold Montgomery. Below it, almost too small to see, was a date. It was Finn's birthday. Laurie's breath hitched. Walter had told her it was his own baby rattle, a family heirloom. But why would it be engraved with Finn's date of birth? He must have had it engraved. It wasn't a hand-me-down. It was a specific, deliberate gift, a statement. Her mind raced back to the time of Finn's conception. It had been a difficult period. She and Walter had been arguing. He was distant, stressed, traveling constantly. They had almost separated. Then, during a fragile reconciliation, a single, passionate night had brought them back together. 9 months later, Finn was born. Walter had been overjoyed, but in a way Laurie now recognized as relief. He had poured resources into her bakery then, encouraged her independence. It was as if he was setting her up, making sure she was provided for, but at arm's length. Was it possible? Could that one night, could he have known or suspected? And was his entire life with her since then? The separate houses, the carefully walled-off worlds, an elaborate, decade-long attempt to protect a secret? She clutched the rattle in her hand. Tomorrow she would have her answer, and she was terrified it would confirm her worst fears, that she was a fool chasing a ghost. But for the first time in a long time, she was also terrified that it wouldn't. The Sanford Genetics Center was a place devoid of personality. The walls were a sterile white, the floors were a polished gray linoleum, and the air smelled faintly of rubbing alcohol. It was a place of cold, hard facts, where sentiment and emotion were stripped away, leaving only the unblinking truth of a double helix. Laurie and Finn arrived first. Finn, curious and a little nervous, clutched her hand. He wore his favorite jeans and a t-shirt with a picture of the solar system on it. Laurie had tried to explain it to him in the simplest terms. "We're just going to do a little test, sweetie. A doctor's going to use a cotton swab, like a Q-tip, to rub the inside of your cheek. It won't hurt at all. It's to help with some grown-up paperwork for Dad Walter." Finn, ever the literalist, had only one question. "Will it tell us if Pluto is a planet again?" Laurie had smiled, a genuine smile for the first time in days. "No, honey. I don't think it's that kind of science." They were shown into a private waiting room. A few minutes later, Giselle and Leo swept in, accompanied by their own lawyer. The contrast was stark. Leo was dressed in a crisp beige blazer, looking like a miniature CEO, a bored expression on his face. Giselle was a pillar of tense energy, her face a mask of strained civility. She ignored Laurie completely, focusing her attention on her phone, firing off text messages with sharp, angry taps of her thumb. The silence in the room was deafening. The two boys, unaware they were the central figures in a multi-billion-dollar drama, occasionally glanced at each other with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. Finally, a lab technician in a white coat called Leo's name. "Leo Dubois?" Giselle stood, smoothing her son's blazer. "Come along, darling. Let's get this foolishness over with." She shot a venomous look at Laurie as she walked past. They were gone for less than 5 minutes. When they returned, Leo was rubbing his cheek. "That was weird," he announced to no one in particular. "Finn Bennett?" the technician called next. Laurie knelt and looked her son in the eyes. "You ready, buddy? Be brave for me." "Okay, Mom," he said, his small face serious. He walked bravely alongside the technician, glancing back once to give her a reassuring thumbs up. Lori's heart swelled with a fierce protective love. Whatever happened, whatever the results, this boy was her entire world. When he came back, he held a superhero-themed sticker in his hand. "She said I was the best patient of the day," he declared proudly. Mr. Adler and a representative for Beatrice arrived just as they were finishing. The lab director, a prim woman named Dr. Alcott, came into the room holding a clipboard. "The samples have been collected from both children," she announced. "They will now be processed and compared against the sample on file for Mr. Walter Montgomery, case number 734B. As per the court order, the results will be delivered directly and exclusively to Mr. Adler's office. The process typically takes 3 to 5 business days. You will be notified when they are ready." And just like that, it was over. The waiting began. The next few days were an agony of suspense. Lori tried to maintain a normal routine. She woke up, got Finn ready for school, and went to the bakery. She kneaded dough, the familiar, repetitive motion, a small comfort in the chaos of her thoughts. But every time the phone rang, her heart leaped into her throat. Giselle, meanwhile, was unraveling. She canceled her lunch reservations. She stopped taking calls from her financial team. The confident queen was gone, replaced by a caged animal. She was spotted one afternoon having a heated argument in a quiet cafe with a handsome European-looking man. Their voices were low and angry. The man was gesturing wildly. The name Maria had overheard. Pierre seemed to fit him perfectly. Giselle left the cafe alone, her face pale and tear-streaked. Beatrice Montgomery, ever the stoic observer, was quietly making her own moves. She had lunch with Sophie Chen, a meeting that stunned everyone. Over salads at a discreet hotel restaurant, the frosty sister-in-law asked pointed, intelligent questions. She wasn't warm, but she was thorough. She wanted to understand the basis for Lori's claim, the nature of Walter's relationship with Finn, the details of his behavior in the last years of his life. She was a woman who valued truth above all else, and she was beginning to suspect that the truth of her brother's life was far more complex than she had ever imagined. On the 5th day, a Friday afternoon, the call came. It was Mr. Adler's assistant. "Mr. Adler requests your presence at his office on Monday morning at 10 a.m. for the presentation of the genetic test results. All relevant parties have been summoned." Lori's hand trembled as she hung up the phone. 3 days. She had 3 more days until she knew. She looked around her bakery, at the warm, flour-dusted surfaces, the comforting smell of her life's work. She didn't know if this was the end of her simple life or the beginning of an entirely new, terrifying one. She closed the shop early and picked Finn up from school. Instead of going home, she drove to the park. They fed the ducks, kicked a soccer ball around, and lay on the grass, looking for shapes in the clouds. She held him tight, breathing in the scent of his hair, trying to brand this simple, perfect moment into her memory. "I love you, Finn," she whispered into his hair. "No matter what happens, you and I are a team. Always." "I love you too, Mom," he said, squeezing her back. "Are we a team like the Avengers?" "Even better," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We're Team Bennett." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, a profound sense of peace settled over her. She had done all she could do. The truth was now in a sealed envelope, waiting, and for the first time she felt ready to face it. The boardroom at Adler, Finch and Strauss felt even colder and more imposing on Monday morning. The air was thick with a palpable, suffocating tension. Everyone was present. Lori sat with Sophie, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her heart a frantic bird beating against her ribs. Across the table, Giselle sat next to her lawyer, her face a carefully constructed mask of indifference, but her constantly tapping fingers betrayed her agitation. Beatrice Montgomery was at the head of the table, her expression as stern and unyielding as a hanging judge. Mr. Adler entered carrying a single, sealed manila envelope. He didn't offer greetings or pleasantries. He sat down, placed the envelope in the exact center of the gleaming table, and put his hands on top of it. "I have received the certified report from the Sanford Genetic Center," he announced, his voice grave. The report contains the analysis of the DNA samples from Leo Dubois and Finn Bennett, compared against the verified sample of Walter Montgomery. He looked at Giselle. The primary purpose of this test, as stipulated in the will, was to confirm the paternity of the designated heir, Leo Dubois. Giselle lifted her chin, a flicker of her old arrogance returning. Then let's get on with it. Confirm it, and let us move on with our lives. Mr. Adler held her gaze. He slid a letter opener under the flap of the envelope and slid it open with a soft, final rip. He pulled out a multi-page document, stapled at the corner. He scanned the first page, his expression unchanging. The report begins with the analysis of subject Leo Dubois, he said, his voice slow and deliberate. He looked up from the page, his eyes settling on Giselle. A genetic comparison was performed between Walter Montgomery and Leo Dubois across 23 distinct genetic markers. He paused, letting the silence stretch. Every person in the room held their breath. The conclusion of the laboratory is as follows, Mr. Adler continued, reading directly from the report. The alleged father, Walter Montgomery, is excluded as the biological father of the child, Leo Dubois. The probability of paternity is 0%. The words dropped into the silent room like stones into a deep, still pond. 0%. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the world had frozen. Then Giselle let out a sound, a choked, strangled gasp. No, she whispered, her voice cracking. No, that's not possible. It's a mistake. The lab made a mistake. They mixed up the samples. The chain of custody for the samples was documented and legally verified, Giselle, Mr. Adler said, his voice firm but not unkind. There was no mistake. There has to be, she shrieked, her composure shattering like glass. She jumped to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Walter is his father. He is. Laurie stared at her, stunned into silence. The laughing, triumphant mistress was gone. In her place was a desperate, frantic woman on the edge of a precipice. Beatrice Montgomery's face was a study in controlled rage. She looked at Giselle with pure, unadulterated contempt. All this time, Beatrice said, her voice low and dangerous, all this time you have been playing this family for fools? You brought a stranger's child and tried to pass him off as a Montgomery. He is not a stranger's child, Giselle sobbed, tears now streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. Walter and I, but the lie was too big to hold. It crumbled under the weight of the scientific fact lying on the table. Her carefully constructed world was collapsing around her in a storm of her own making. Laurie felt a dizzying wave of emotions, shock, disbelief, and a profound, unexpected pang of pity for the weeping woman across the table. But before she could fully process this first revelation, Mr. Adler cleared his throat, holding up the report. There is more, he said, his voice cutting through Giselle's hysterics. He looked directly at Laurie. The kindness was back in his eyes, mixed with something that looked like awe. As per the judge's addendum, a second test was performed. He turned to the next page of the report. A genetic comparison was performed between Walter Montgomery and Finn Bennett. Laurie's heart stopped. This was it, the moment of truth. She gripped Sophie's hand so hard her knuckles turned white. Mr. Adler took a deep breath. The results show a conclusive match at all 23 genetic markers. The report concludes, the probability of paternity is 99.9999999%. Walter Montgomery cannot be excluded as the biological father of the child, Finn Bennett. He looked up from the page, a small, almost imperceptible smile on his lips. Congratulations, Mrs. Bennett. Your son, Finn Bennett, is Walter Montgomery's biological son. According to the explicit terms of the will, he is the sole and undisputed heir to the entire Montgomery fortune. The silence that followed was of a different kind. It was the silence of a universe reordering itself. Giselle let out a wail of pure despair and collapsed back into her chair, her face in her hands. Her sobs were the only sound in the room. Her lawyer looked stunned, useless. Beatrice slowly turned her head to look at Laurie. The ice in her eyes had melted, replaced by a look of utter, profound shock. She wasn't looking at the little baker anymore. She was looking at the mother of her brother's only child, her nephew. But Lori could barely hear them. The words echoed in her mind. Your son is his son, the sole and undisputed heir. It was true. The impossible, insane hope she had clung to was true. Walter had known, or at least he had suspected enough to put that clause in his will, a final, desperate gambit to uncover the truth from beyond the grave. Her life with him, their separate existence, it hadn't been because she was unimportant. It had been to protect Finn, to keep him safe from the grasping, complicated world that Giselle inhabited, a world Walter was trying to escape. He hadn't abandoned his son. He had hidden him in plain sight. Tears streamed down Lori's face, but they were not tears of grief or humiliation. They were tears of vindication, of love, of a decade of questions finally being answered. She looked out the skyscraper window at the city Walter had built. It wasn't his legacy anymore. It was Finn's. And she, Lori Bennett, the poor wife, the simple baker, was its guardian. The real queen had just been revealed, not by a crown, but by a simple cotton swab. The aftermath of the revelation was a quiet explosion that sent shockwaves through the lives of everyone involved. Giselle Dubois' downfall was as swift as it was brutal. In her hysterical breakdown, she confessed everything. Leo's biological father was Pierre Delacroix, a French art dealer with whom she'd had a long-standing affair. She had passed Leo off as Walter's, securing a life of unimaginable luxury built on a foundation of deceit. Walter, ever the shrewd businessman, had evidently grown suspicious over the years, leading to the masterstroke in his will, the DNA clause, his final posthumous checkmate. Stripped of her claim, Giselle was evicted from the penthouse. The credit cards were canceled, the cars repossessed. Pierre, upon learning that his son was not the heir to billions, but was now the center of a massive scandal, vanished back to Europe, leaving Giselle to face the consequences alone. The press had a field day with the story, The Billionaire's Gambit, The Faker and the Baker. Giselle became a pariah, a cautionary tale whispered about at the charity galas she was no longer invited to. Lori, however, refused to be a part of the spectacle. She declined every interview request, shielding Finn from the media storm with the ferocity of a lioness. Her first act as the guardian of Finn's estate was not to move into the penthouse or buy a fleet of luxury cars. It was to hire the best child psychologist in the city to help Finn navigate the seismic changes in his life. Her second act was to meet with Beatrice Montgomery. They met not in a sterile boardroom, but in Lori's cozy, flour-dusted kitchen. Beatrice arrived looking uncomfortable, her severe suit out of place amongst the cooling racks of sourdough and brioche. Lori offered her a cup of coffee and a warm croissant. Beatrice accepted, taking a hesitant bite. Her stern facade seemed to soften as the buttery pastry melted in her mouth. My brother, Beatrice began, her voice strained, was a complicated man. I misjudged you, Lori. I see that now. I thought you were his weakness. It turns out you and your son were his strength, his only real truth. She looked at Lori, her eyes filled with a remorse that seemed genuine. I would like to know my nephew, if you'll allow it. Lori saw not the icy matriarch from the funeral, but a woman grieving her brother and grappling with a lifetime of misunderstandings. He'll need his family, Beatrice, Lori said softly. He'll need to know where he came from. It was the beginning of an unlikely but powerful alliance. The Montgomery Holdings Board of Directors, a grim-faced collection of men in pinstripes, were initially wary of the baker who now effectively controlled the company through her son's trust. They expected her to be a puppet, easily manipulated. They were wrong. Lori attended the first board meeting with Sophie and Beatrice by her side. She didn't pretend to understand complex financial derivatives or hostile takeovers. Instead, she spoke about legacy. Walter Montgomery built this company to create things that last, she said, her voice clear and steady in the intimidating room. Buildings, communities. Finn's legacy will not be about just accumulating wealth, but about building things of value. We will continue to be profitable, but we will also be ethical. We will invest in community projects, in affordable housing, in sustainable architecture. Montgomery Holdings will stand for something more than just a number on a stock ticker. The old guard was stunned, But Lori, with Beatrice's support and Sophie's legal acumen, began to slowly but surely reshape the company's culture. She was not a titan of industry, but she had something more powerful, an unshakable moral compass. She never moved into the penthouse. She and Finn stayed in their cozy house on Orchard Lane. She used a portion of the estate's funds to pay off her home and bakery, securing her own independence. Then she opened 3 new locations of the Rolling Pin, creating dozens of jobs and establishing a profit-sharing program for her employees. Her hands, once covered in dough out of necessity, were now covered in dough out of joy. One afternoon, Mr. Adler called. Giselle's lawyers had reached out. She was destitute, struggling to make ends meet for herself and Leo. Lori thought for a long time. She thought of the laughing, cruel woman at the will reading, but she also thought of Leo, a little boy who was just as innocent in all this as Finn was. She established a modest, anonymous trust, administered through Mr. Adler's office. It would be enough to cover Leo's education and living expenses until he was 18. There was one condition. Giselle could never contact Lori or Finn again. It was not an act of forgiveness, but one of compassion. It was a final closing of a painful chapter, done on her own terms. One crisp autumn evening, a year after Walter's death, Lori was in her kitchen, teaching Finn how to knead bread. His small hands, dusted with flour, pushed and folded the dough. Beatrice was there, sitting at the table, a genuine smile on her face as she watched them. The house was filled with the warm, comforting scent of baking bread and the sound of Finn's happy laughter. Lori looked at her son, his face a perfect, beautiful blend of her features and the ones she now recognized from the man she had loved. She had the money, the power, the empire. But in that quiet, simple moment, surrounded by family and the smell of home, she knew what true wealth really was. It wasn't the fortune Walter had left behind. It was the legacy he had hidden, the son he had protected, and the incredible, unexpected strength she had found within herself. She was no longer the poor wife. She was Lori Bennett, and she was finally, completely free. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a shocking DNA test or a hidden fortune. It was a story about the nature of truth and the quiet strength of integrity. Lori Bennett started with nothing but her dignity, while Giselle Dubois had everything but. When the lie that held up Giselle's world was exposed, her entire life crumbled into dust, leaving her with nothing. But Lori, who never asked for a fortune, was the one who was truly rich all along. Rich in character, in love for her son, and in the simple, honest work of her hands. She reminds us that true power isn't about the money you have, but the values you hold. The world may be drawn to loud, flashy displays of wealth, but real, lasting legacies are built on foundations of truth. What did you think of Lori's final act of quiet compassion for Leo? Let us know in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please give this video a like, share it with someone who loves a story of justice, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas where the truth always finds its way to the light.